Hello, seventh graders. As you know, we are now talking about evolution. And the theory of evolution, one of the things it does is it helps explain how come we see so many different species on the planet today. In fact, Charles Darwin's book that described natural selection and evolution is known as The Origin of Species. His attempt to create a theory, evolution, that explained how come there are so many different species on the tree of life. But that brings up a very important question then. What is a species? So let's start with a simple definition, one that you should know. A species is a population of organisms that successfully share genetic information on a consistent basis. Now note that I do say successfully. That's going to come up later. Normally we see species as, well, obviously a tree is a different species than a rose, and a rose is a different species from a squirrel, and in most cases, a squirrel is a different species from the average seventh grader. So normally, organisms that look distinctly different are different species. But what happens if species are similar? Well, we go back to this definition. A species is a population of organisms that successfully share genetic information on a consistent basis. Now, before we move on, I do want to make one point in this video that you should know. Much of the time, members of the same species will look similar to one another. Once again, allowing for variation, which is good. So one giraffe may look slightly different than another giraffe. And though there are obvious differences between males and females, there are times where these differences are so great that you might even think that they are different species. For example, this is a hairy anglerfish. It's a deep water fish. What you see here, the larger fish, is the female. But down here, right down at the bottom, is actually the male, which is a fraction of the size and does not have this really neat bioluminescent stalk near its mouth. And the reason for that is that the male, as soon as it's hatched, swims around, looks for a female, bites onto the female, and then lives much like a vampire for the rest of its life on the female. The female does all the feeding, and the male only exists as a source of reproductive sperm material. And so this male looks so different from the female that you might, if you collected them separately, think they were different species. But here is the important thing. Because a species is a population of organisms that successfully share genetic information, well, that's exactly what the male is doing. It's sharing genetic information. So a species is not defined by what the animal looks like. It's defined by sharing genetic information. Now, there are 4 reasons why one species might be separate or not allowed to share genetic information with another species. So one way to think about this is we are looking for 4 obstacles to sharing genetic information. And these are the 4 reasons. Now we're going to go into them in detail in the slides to come, but they are geographic, temporal, we'll explain what that means later. We would use the word in science physiological, but it's okay for you to know the word at this point physical and what we will call genetic. Again, in science we would sometimes talk about genetic viability, but as a one-word reminder for the 4 reasons why populations cannot share their DNA, they are geographic, temporal, physical, and genetic. Let's look at each individually now. So let's first talk about geographic isolation. On the left here we have a male lion, and over here we have a female tiger. Now, in captivity, when these 2 animals are brought together, very often they will reproduce, and they will create an offspring that we give the name liger too. And if you've ever heard about a liger, it's a real animal, and it is the offspring of both a lion and a tiger, which are considered two different species. The reason why we consider them actually different species, even though they can share genetic information, is that in most cases they don't. And why don't they? Well, lions, in most cases, live here in Africa, and tigers live here throughout Asia. So lions and tigers do not usually mix except in captivity to form the liger. So we consider them different species. The tiger is Panthera leo, and the tiger is Panthera tigris. That last word is the species name, and they are considered to be different species because they do not share geographic locations, and thus because they do not share geographic locations, they do not normally share genetic information. Now, temporal isolation is a little harder to get your head around, but not much. Here we have two different types, and it very often happens in plants, but there are animal examples. But I'm going to use a plant example here. On the left, we have what's called a Sitka spruce. And over here is what we call a black spruce. Now, these plants have very often overlapping reproductive ranges, and more importantly, since they both reproduce from pollen, it is very possible for the pollen from this tree to be blown the relatively short distance that separates it from the black spruce. They live at slightly different elevations in the what we call the boreal forests of the north, but the important thing to remember is this. When the Sitka spruce is releasing its pollen is at a different time than when the black spruce releases its pollen. And this is part of how these two plants speciated or separated from their common ancestor. The Sitka spruce, their pollen will only pollinate other Sitka spruces because they are only ready to reproduce for a narrow time of the year. At a different time of the year, the black spruce will release its pollen, and again, even though the wind could let the pollen spread from one place to another, the pollen does not intermingle. You don't have to worry about black spruce pollen pollinating a Sitka spruce because they release pollen at different times of the year. The word temporal relates to time. So these two species are different in part because they do not share genetic information because they are temporally isolated from sharing genetic information. Now, I think some of you are going to find this next one a little bit funny. Very often, we do not share genetic information because, well, for lack of a better word, plumbing. The parts don't fit. Now, in dogs, we sometimes, through selective breeding, have created subspecies, we would call them breeds of dogs, that are so physically different in size that they could not practically share genetic information. There's no way that this little Chihuahua will inseminate this large dog. But theoretically, they could share genetic information through a medium-sized dog. But let's talk about a more natural example. Here is a bird, the ostrich, one of the larger of the birds. Now, if I were to introduce a hummingbird into the same area where this ostrich is located, and here the hummingbird is actually much larger than it would be in nature, there's no way that this little hummingbird is going to impregnate this somewhat larger ostrich. We would call that physical isolation. The parts just don't fit. And if you don't know what I mean by plumbing and parts, the joke just may be on you. Ask your parents. Let's move on now. The last of our 4 isolations is what we call genetic isolation. On the left here we have a horse, and humans very often will breed together horses and a similar animal known as the donkey. And together, they create a mule, which in the vast majority of cases, now there have been a few cases where a horse can inseminate a female mule. But if I had an island full of mules, they cannot reproduce. The male mules cannot reproduce with the female mules. Part of the reason for this is even though horses and donkeys can exist in the same areas, that they have slightly different genetic numbers. You will notice that my N number for the horse is 32, giving it a 2N number of 64. In mules, my N number is 31, and its 2N number is 62. You'll notice that in mules, this means that the 2N number is 63, which means when you have meiosis, well, how do you get half of 23? So these mules tend to be sterile and cannot breed. So because horses cannot successfully breed and share genetic information in an offspring that will then breed with other animals, since it usually ends with the mule, we will say that the horse is a different species than the donkeys. And the reason is again, they are genetically isolated from one another. So let's go ahead and review one last time. A species is a group of organisms that share genetic information. And what are our roadblocks to sharing? Well, they can be geographic. Think about lions and tigers. Think temporal, which is very often when plants give off pollen. If you give off pollen in the spring and another plant gives off pollen in the fall, there is no chance of sharing genetic information. They can be physical. These are these plumbing issues that we talked about before. And lastly, you can be genetically isolated. Think about mules and donkeys. Well, that's it, guys. That's what you need to know. This is what makes species separate from one another.